And you are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, September the 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for joining. Apologies for last night, ladies and gentlemen. Had a number of technical issues that had to be solved, and it just took an extraordinarily long time. And as a consequence, we ended up not broadcasting a show last night. But that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I know you guys were going through some kind of withdrawal. I think I heard some rioting outside my house last night. People were very unhappy that they didn't get their Joseph Ben-Ami fix last night. They were looking forward to it. You know, Monday to Thursday, it's almost like a religion for people, I guess. Anyway, glad to be with you again tonight. Apologies for that. And as we like to say, back in the saddle again. And you know, as a person who has done a significant amount of horseback riding over the course of his life, I have been thrown more than once. I don't think I'm going to use the term many times, but I've been thrown more than once. And the best thing to do is when you're thrown, if you're not seriously injured, is to get right back up in that saddle. Not just to make sure that you yourself don't experience whatever frustration or hesitation or reticence in getting on the horse again, but to make sure that that horse knows that you're the boss, not him. Because those horses, a horse is a very strong animal, and you don't want it to get the impression that he or she or it is in charge, because they are not in charge. You have to be in charge. Oh, yeah, so this is not the equestrian show. Oh, lots of interesting things in the news today and ongoing. Again, here in Canada, we're still in the Freedom Convoy trial. It is now day 7 of the trial and still waiting for the Crown prosecutor to present witnesses who are going to testify to these individuals. Tamara Lich and Chris Barber having committed any real crimes. Really, you know, this trial is going to come down to the simple question of whether or not encouraging people to hold the line at a protest or encouraging people to participate in a protest are in fact crimes. And if they are crimes, remember what these guys were charged with. They were charged with mischief, counseling others to commit mischief. So even if they're crimes, they're about as minor a crime as you can think of. So, you know, the very fact that here we are, we're now on day 7 of a scheduled 16-day trial. And the judge the other day was exasperated and suggesting that the slow pace and what appears to be the disorganization, although she didn't use those words, the disorganization of the Crown prosecutors is going to cause the trial to be extended even further. By the way, for those of you who do not live in Canada, when we talk about Crown prosecutors, the Crown, because we're a constitutional monarchy, King Charles is the King of Canada. So when we talk about the Crown, all of the government is the Crown, okay? So King Charles doesn't get to just up and decide what's happening and what's not happening, okay? That's not the way it works. He's bound by constitutional rules, etc. So that's why we call it a constitutional monarchy. So the country operates almost as if there was no king at all, but pro forma, as a matter of formality, the government is the Crown. So when we talk about the Crown Prosecution Service, that is the prosecutors are the government prosecutors. So if you're in the United States and you're catching the show, that's kind of like district attorneys. The district attorney, the special prosecutor, the prosecutor working for the district attorney's office would be the same thing, the equivalent. Anyway, there's really nothing new to report here. You know, the trial is just dragging on and dragging on and dragging on, and the prosecution is presenting, you know, tweets, Facebook postings, etc., And none of these are in dispute. What really is this going to come down to? It's going to come down to whether or not posting something on Facebook saying, hold the line in a protest constitutes a crime, let alone a major crime, any crime, let alone a major crime. So there's really not much more to report than that. I guess I could go on for hours about this, but I'd only be repeating myself. So, I suggest that maybe you might want to go back and listen to a couple of the previous podcasts where we've treated this particular subject in detail. Moving on, Justin Trudeau back in Canada again. Here's something that we didn't actually cover before, but it's an embarrassment of epic proportions. Our Prime Minister goes to India to attend and participate in the G20 summit. And when the summit is over, he decides it's time to come home. That's part of his schedule. It's not like he just out of the blue decided. So he can't. And why can't he come home? Because his plane, the government plane that ferries the Prime Minister around, is broken down. Now, these things happen. Mechanical devices fail from time to time. There's no big surprise here. There's no shocking event. It's not a shocking event. What is shocking is that the Prime Minister of Canada, the second largest country in the world, the oldest dominion in the former British Empire / current Commonwealth, the second oldest democracy in the world, and we don't have a spare airplane to fly out to India, somewhere readily available, to pick up the Prime Minister and fly him back home for important meetings. It's embarrassing. So I'm not sure what happened. Did they have to fly spare parts out? They spent 2 full days fixing that airplane. But who's ever heard of a national leader being stranded because his airplane broke down? Can you imagine something like that happening to Joe Biden? Can you imagine something like that happening to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or Australia or New Zealand or India for that matter, or Russia? It doesn't happen. So are we so in such bad shape in this country, in Canada, that we can't even afford to have standby backup aircraft? Even if they're not sitting on the tarmac somewhere waiting to go, you'd still think that somewhere in our inventory of military aircraft that there would be something available, government aircraft, someone available somewhere on the planet that they could pick up the Prime Minister and bring him home. Now, I know what a lot of you are going, they're going, why would we want that? Okay? All right, I get it. It's funny. It's a joke, okay? But the reality is, okay, the point I'm making is still valid. And, like it or not, Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister. So, the guy's got to come back to Canada. And I know you're thinking, well, if he comes back to Canada, he's just going to create more nuisance. Well, he could create nuisance in Canada from India. Call it telecommuting, okay? If the public servants don't have to come back to the office, if they can telecommute, so can the Prime Minister from India. So it really didn't make any difference. What's the important takeaway from this whole episode is the embarrassment of us not being able to get the Prime Minister home within a reasonable amount of time, to leave him stranded because the one airplane apparently that's available in our entire fleet, the one airplane that's available to ferry the Prime Minister around, broke down. I mean, is it just me? Aren't you embarrassed as well? Doesn't that just say everything about the state of our military? And I'm assuming that it's the military that flies him around. I don't know what the arrangements are these days. But I think that that's a fairly safe assumption to make. But whether it's the military or not, what does it say about the state of affairs that we can't get the Prime Minister home? That he's going to be stranded for 1, 2, 3 days because his plane broke down. That's I'm surprised that the Indian government didn't offer a plane. maybe they did, and the Prime Minister said, no, that's too embarrassing to have to be flown home by one of your planes. I'll put up with the embarrassment of not having a plane available. And what did the Prime Minister do for 2 days in Delhi? I think it was in Delhi, and it was in India anyway. Might have been Bombay. I don't know exactly. What did our Prime Minister do for 2 days? Sightsee? Sleep? Hang out by the pool? I don't know. Anyway, it's an embarrassing episode. Sorry that I'm genuinely sorry that it happened. It's just, it makes us look like, I don't know, amateurs. And maybe that's fair. Maybe it's because we are amateurs. I don't know. That if we are, that's a new development, relatively new. Okay, it's not the way it was when I was in the service. But anyway, that's just the way that things are going right now. So anyway, so now Prime Minister gets back to Ottawa yesterday, Tuesday, and he's in London this afternoon meeting with his caucus. There's a national caucus meeting in London, Ontario, not England. So the the Liberal caucus is meeting in London. And this was not, I'm pretty sure that this was not an actual planned meeting. They just had their national caucus retreat in Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island a couple of weeks ago. And that's where they really sort of planned strategy, planned their legislative agenda for the upcoming session of Parliament, et cetera, et cetera. And on the subject, on the agenda at that meeting, had to be the poor polling numbers. The Prime Minister is not polling well. The Liberal Party is not polling well. We talked about this the other day. The Conservative Party is polling fairly well. They're right now sitting 10 points ahead of the Liberals. They're at 38% in the national polls, relatively consistently. And the Liberals are down to 28%, and the NDP is down to 18%. All of this is to say that if an election were held today, it is entirely possible. I'm not yet going to say it's probable. You know, once we hit that 40% range for any political party, then it's fair to say that they probably, if there was an general election, they'd probably end up with a majority government. We're not quite at that stage yet, but it's there. Certainly, I've seen majority governments with less than 38% of the popular vote here in Canada. So let's say that the Conservatives could very well form a majority if an election were held today or tomorrow. And they're moving into pretty solid majority territory as they continue to climb in the polls. So along comes the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party, and they now are, I did a show with Nick Vandergraat last week, and he likes to say they're in full panic mode. And I was resisting using that terminology to characterize what's going on in the Liberal caucus right now. But it's entirely, feasible now. It's plausible that they are in some sort of a panic mode. So here they are having an unscheduled impromptu meeting, and the subject of the meeting is going to be, by all reports in the media, their tanking polling numbers. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of unease, unhappiness, and for really the first time today, the mainstream media is starting to report unrest in the backbenches and specific criticisms, not just we're a little nervous, but there are some very specific criticisms that are being leveled now by backbenchers in the Liberal caucus directed at the Prime Minister. Principally, what they're saying to him is, you're not listening to us. You're just listening to people in the cabinet, which is kind of like the small club that, Mr. Trudeau has formed and when I look at the cabinet today, I don't see any big names. I don't see any gravitas amongst cabinet members, I'm sorry to say. All fairly, I'm sure, decent people, but there's nobody that fits that image of me that I have of a senior political leader. So it's almost as though the cabinet is simply made up of people who would be junior ministers in any other serious government, or if they were in the cabinet at all. What it is it's kind of like a Justin Trudeau sycophants club. That's what it strikes me as. And, we talked about this a few times. The real problem that I keep saying conservatives, that the Liberal Party has, is that all of the problems that people are experiencing, that people are paying attention to now, that are they're problems that not only that the Liberals have not been that concerned about, but they're the direct result of the Liberals' policies. So when you take inflation, for instance, inflation is largely caused by overregulation by this government, mostly dealing with climate change, the carbon tax, and all kinds of things like that. And so what that does is it pushes up the cost of manufacturing, it pushes up the cost of transportation, of materials, of food getting to the grocery store, pushes up the cost of producing food to get to the grocery store, and then there's the added cost of, you getting from point A to point B. And, all of this talk about, rapid transit and public transit to here, it's nonsensical. This is a big country. People drive cars here because public transit is not convenient. If you just live in the city and in a city and you have fairly efficient, clean public transit, you use it to get around, from point A to point B in the city. But you don't go from one end of the city to the other using public transit. You might use it to get from your house to your office if you're working downtown, something like that. Or you just use it locally. But, to get from one end of the city to the other, generally you don't use public transit. And certainly to get from one city to the next, you don't use public transit. In a place like Japan or Germany or Great Britain, you can use public transit. Okay? They've got great train systems, and the geography is small, so traveling from one city to the next city is on higher speed trains. It's a doable thing. It's not that inconvenient. Here, it's tremendously inconvenient. Remember, I was saying the other day, as an illustration, the city of Kenora, Ontario, which is close to the western border of the province of Ontario, is a 2-day drive from where I am in Ottawa, which is fairly close to the eastern border of Ontario. And you can add on another hour to the east and another hour to the west. The point is, it's a big province, and that's just one province. It takes more than 5 days to drive across Canada. It's a big country. So, if you've got business in Winnipeg or Edmonton or Calgary or Vancouver, you're not going to take public transit. You'll fly, or if you're going to go on vacation, you're going to drive. If you happen to be doing business in Toronto for a couple of days, chances are you're going to get in the car and drive from Ottawa. 4-hour drive, 5-hour drive. So public transit just doesn't work very well here in Canada. So the very fact that we've increased the cost of fuel by putting this carbon tax on, has significantly, drastically raised the cost of transportation. And transportation meaning just for you, consumers, commuters, but also transportation for getting food and material to, and goods, etc., to the markets. And speaking about public transit still runs on fossil fuel. So, somehow or other you have to, if you're going to increase the cost of gasoline for buses, someone's going to pay for that. And that's normally taxpayers, because taxpayers generally subsidize public transit. So your municipal taxes go up. And on this subject, here's a thing that perhaps other people haven't even noticed, is that the new mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, the city of Toronto is so cash starved right now. And it's the added cost of fuel for the buses. Remember, it's a big city, lots of buses, lots of city employees that are driving gas-fired cars and trucks. So these people, okay, all of that adds up to more cost to the city. Now, this isn't the only reason why the city of Toronto is expressing or experiencing fiscal difficulties right now. They have all kinds of a mess over there that they have to sort out. But it's not an insignificant addition to the budget. And again, that's all because the federal government is charging this in order to stop climate change. And the city of Toronto now is so desperate that the mayor is trying to find ways to implement a city sales tax. I mean, that's just ludicrous when you think about it. I mean, it's stupid when you think about it, okay? Really, if you have a problem with your budget, the very first thing you should be doing is looking at your spending. But nobody wants to look at spending. Everybody wants to look at revenue. Okay, well, revenue might be a problem, but in our situation today, revenue is not a problem. People are taxed to death in this country. Adding a sales tax to Toronto? I can tell you this much. If they put a sales tax on in Toronto, you will not find me or many other people doing any kind of shopping in Toronto. We may go to Toronto, we may visit Toronto, but when it comes time to going out as tourists or whatever and doing shopping, well, we're driving north to Vaughan, or we're driving east to Pickering, or we're driving west to Mississauga. All very doable things. Let's take a break, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Don't go away. And we are back. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm Joseph Ben-Ami. I am your host, and you were tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, September the 13th, 2023. We were just talking about, a few different items, somewhat connected. I want to return back to the subject of this Liberal caucus meeting in London, Ontario that's going on today, and the fact that the Liberal backbenchers in the Liberal Party are starting to complain anonymously still, but they're willing to talk to reporters about how unhappy they are with the current Prime Minister, with the leader of the Liberal Party. That would be Justin Trudeau. That's a new thing, and it's a very big danger signal. And the reason I bring this up is because, the Conservative Party, I think, should be very circumspect about where they're sitting in the polls right now. I realize that they are, for sure, feeling comfortable, they're feeling confident, and they have every right to be. But I am not convinced that the Liberal Party of Canada is going to go into the next general election with Justin Trudeau as its leader. I'm just not convinced about it. I'm not predicting that they're going to dump him, but there are cracks in the caucus right now, and the Liberal Party is usually pretty disciplined. The caucus is usually pretty disciplined. So it's a big deal when reporters start getting backbenchers openly complaining about the Prime Minister, about their leader, about his style of leadership, and particularly about the policies that are his pet policies that are really at the center of the problems that people are experiencing, that, they're going to be, when the time comes, we have a term, it's called ballot question. When you go to mark your ballot in an election, what is the question you're asking yourself that is going to compel you to vote for one candidate from a party or another candidate from a different party? And for many people right now, that ballot question is going to be things like cost of living, housing, inflation, and all of the problems that we're experiencing right now in this country are a direct consequence of government policies that are fueling those issues. For example, I've already talked about the carbon tax and the regulatory policies that are being forced on Canadians, forced on manufacturers, forced on businesses in order to deal with climate change. And Canadians, they're concerned about climate change, but they quite rightfully don't see us as being the problem when it comes to climate change. Now, I'm not touching in this particular segment, in this particular episode, I don't want to get into whether or not climate change is man-made or anything like that. You know my position on that. But whether it's man-made or not, let's just, in fact, for the sake of argument, let's just say that it's completely man-made. Well, Canada produces less than 2% of all of the carbon dioxide emissions in the world on an annual basis. And we're not going to get much better than that because of the size of the country. And I've already said, if you're going to do business in Vancouver, you're going to get on a plane, you're going to fly 5 hours to Vancouver if you happen to be in Ottawa or Toronto. It's a big country, and people drive cars. And people drive cars not only because it's a big country, but because it's a cold country as well. So, people don't want to be standing outside in the cold for half an hour waiting for a bus that may or may not show up. So there are reasons why people drive cars. And number one is because it's convenient. And so far, electric cars have not yet caught on in Canada. And the reason they haven't caught on in Canada is because they don't offer the kind of reliability and convenience that gasoline-powered cars offer. So all of the cost that's involved, all of the taxes that the government has to collect in order to pay its subsidies and implement its programs, all of that adds to the cost of living. The inflated cost of fuel adds to the cost of living. All of this is what's driving inflation mostly in this country. But it's not just inflation. If we look at the housing market, there's a reason why we have a problem with the housing market. Again, I know I'm repeating myself. I've said it before, but it's worth repeating over and over again so people get it into their heads. I know that they're talking about this afternoon in London. The caucus is talking about what they're going to do in order to help alleviate the housing shortage. Well, the fastest, most effective answer that can be implemented immediately to the housing shortage is to reduce the number of people that are coming into the country. we don't owe anybody any right to live in Canada. I don't have a problem with people coming to this country. I don't have a problem with immigration. I don't have a problem with immigrants. I'm not calling in principle for a reduction in immigration. What I'm calling for is a reduction in immigration on the specific issue to address the specific issue of a shortage in housing. We don't need another government program that we have to find the money to pay for, which means going back to taxpayers again. And here's the other thing about that, okay? Just as a slight digression, just remember this. The government can come back and say, well, we're just going to run a bit of a deficit. Well, what they really mean is you're going to increase the size of the existing deficit. But remember this, okay? Deficits are nothing more than deferred taxation. At some point in time, somebody's got to pay those bills, either in higher taxes or reduced services. So just because the government is not raising the tax rate for you today doesn't mean that the tax rate is not going to be artificially high 10 years from now or 20 years from now because we have to pay those bills. So remember this, okay? A deficit is a tax increase, deferred. Somebody is going to pay that tax. And it's terribly selfish of us to shrug our shoulders and say, I don't care, it's not my problem, let the next generation or generations figure that out. So as I say, you're looking at higher taxes, whether today or tomorrow, in order to pay for these programs. And now they're talking about a new program, I don't know what it's going to look like, at the federal level to increase the speed at which housing is being developed. Well, there's a huge market for housing. We don't need a government program to increase the speed. Here's another suggestion, although this doesn't fall into the ambit of the federal government. This is mostly municipal governments. Reduce the red tape that slows down development. Just reduce it. Cut the red tape. Cut the expenses that you are charging to property developers that end up adding to the cost of the housing. These are all things that can be done today. But instead what we have is we have a liberal government now that's sitting down and saying, let's create a new program to address this issue. Let's create a new cure for an illness that we are creating. Just stop the illness. Okay? I don't need... It's like this, okay? The government is breaking my fingers and then telling me that I need a program to fix my broken fingers. Don't break my fingers in the first place. I don't need a program to heal the problem. I need for you to stop breaking my fingers. It's crazy. The world is just going... is it fair to say that the world is just going insane? I don't know anymore, ladies and gentlemen. So we're going to see what's going to happen. But as I say, I am not convinced that the Liberal Party is going to have Justin Trudeau as its leader into the next election. I am quite certain that Justin Trudeau wants to be the leader going into the next election. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I don't have inside information. I'm just saying, from what I know of the man, he wants to do this, okay? But every prime minister, every senior politician has a shelf life. Justin Trudeau, notwithstanding the other very real, concrete, tangible issues of poor policy planning, etc., he's just reached his shelf life. Canadians are just tired of him. And this fiasco of being stranded in India for a couple of days because his plane broke down, that, ladies and gentlemen, does nothing to improve his image. Nothing at all to improve his image. On the contrary. It just makes him look like more of a buffoon. And that's not even fair. So, I don't know. I guess we're going to have to start getting used to the idea of Prime Minister Poilievre. Hey, well, good for him. The Canadian dream. He's had not an easy life, and to rise to the position where he is now is a testament not just to his own diligence and hard work, but also a testament to the inclusivity of this country. When people talk about how Canadian society, as it is now, Western society is not fair, not just, not inclusive. Look at a guy like Pierre Poilievre, and he has not had everything handed to him by far. And yet he's on the verge, possibly, of, in fact, maybe even probably, of becoming the next Prime Minister of Canada. And he's done it. I know. I've been there. I with him. Somewhat. I've known Pierre for a long time on a personal level. I worked with him when he was working on as a staff person. So, I know Pierre. And I'm telling you that no silver spoon, no special treatment, no networks, I've got I went to McGill University and I've got the alumni behind me. There's no network there that was supporting Pierre Poilievre on his rise to become the leader of the Conservative Party. He's done it entirely on merit and entirely on having a very good sense of what is troubling the people and wanting to address those issues. Will he succeed? I don't know. We'll have to see. Only time will tell, my friends. Let's take our second break, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back here in a couple of minutes on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Please don't go away. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for September the 13th, 2023, Wednesday. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thank you so much for staying with us. Let's shift our sights away from domestic politics here in Canada for a bit and talk a little bit about what's going on in the state of Israel, where the Supreme Court is now holding hearings on petitions by private citizens that have been brought before it in order to have the court strike down the reforms, some of the reforms that the government, the Knesset, which is Israel's parliament, has made to the Supreme Court. Reforms with respect to what the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is. And the reason I want to talk about this is because it's interesting, it's in the news, and there's a lot of misinformation about this out there. I'll try to address some of it as we move forward. But what's really interesting is that in a very real way, what's going on in Israel right now, this confrontation that's developed between the Knesset, the government, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, and the court itself, is really the same kind of confrontation, the same issue that we have been dealing with here in Canada on a certain level, and in other countries across the Western world. And that is the relationship between the legislative branches of government and the judicial branches of government and the power of either of them. In Israel, there is no actual written constitution. There is a series of laws, which were called basic laws, that sort of set out the framework of government and et cetera, and how government operates. That's called the basic law or basic laws. And they were formed more or less during the time of the War of Independence and shortly thereafter in Israel. And one of the things is there is a Supreme Court. We don't have the same kind of process where or they don't have the same kind of process in Israel as we have in Canada, where we have, essentially three levels of judiciary, where you have a lower court, and then you can appeal to the appeals court, and then you can appeal from there to the Supreme Court of Canada. So individuals in certain circumstances can just bring a petition directly to the Supreme Court in the state of Israel. And since the 1990s, under the leadership of the head of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, no relation to Ehud Barak, by the way, it's a different person altogether, different family, the Supreme Court took upon itself the right to be able to scrutinize legislation and then to determine whether or not the policies of the government or the legislation of the government is what we're going to call reasonable. It's what they're calling the reasonableness rule in Israel. Essentially what it means is this. If the court decides that a piece of legislation is not reasonable, which is a very subjective term, which is, of course, the problem, right? There's no standard of what's reasonable or not. It's whatever the court decides is reasonable. If the court decides it's reasonable, they let it be. If the court decides it's not reasonable, they strike it down. They invalidate that law. And they do the same thing for policies. And lately, they've been doing the same thing even for things like who should be able to be a particular minister. So the government, the prime minister, decides to appoint a minister. Somebody comes along and petitions the Supreme Court saying, that's not reasonable. And the court says, you're right. That person shouldn't be minister of such and such a thing. So this kind of thing has been going on for some time in Israel. And that's really the issue. The issue is who makes the law in a democratic government, in a democratic society, and who is responsible for adjudicating people's actions vis-a-vis that law. Now, when I say that this is something that's going on elsewhere in the Western world, I could talk about in Canada. Let's look at Canada for a moment. In Canada, the legislative branch of government, Parliament, passed laws many, many years ago prohibiting doctors from assisting patients in committing suicide. That was illegal. It was a criminal offense. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was a case involving a woman by the name of Sue Rodriguez who wanted to commit suicide. She wanted to have a doctor help her to commit suicide. But it's illegal. So she, with the assistance of other people, petitioned the court in order to have them strike down that law as unconstitutional. And that case wound its way eventually all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the law. They said, well, it doesn't matter what anybody's opinion is. The question is whether or not this law is constitutional. If it is constitutional, we're not going to strike it down. And indeed, they did not strike it down. They did rule that it was constitutional. Along comes somebody in 2013, I should say. And, the details of the case are not important because it's essentially the exact same case. There was a person that wanted to commit suicide, wanted a doctor's assistance to do it, petitioned the court said no, the lower court said no, the Court of Appeal said no, made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then rules that this law is unconstitutional, strikes the law down. Now, how is that possible? Well, my friends, it was possible because of a principle that we see applied over and over and over again in our judicial system, which is a new principle, relatively new. It's not from yesterday or the day before yesterday. It's been around and evolving for decades now. And that is the principle of a living constitution. What is a living constitution? A living constitution means that the courts can interpret laws and interpret the Constitution in light of today's public opinion, how people feel about an issue today. That's what a living constitution is. And so the Supreme Court struck down the criminal code provisions prohibiting doctors from assisting patients in committing suicide in 2015. And the justification for striking down that law was that public opinion had changed. Now, I'm not disputing whether public opinion had changed. It's not really relevant to what the point I'm making. Maybe it had, maybe it hadn't. But if public opinion has changed on any particular issue, then it should be determined, the law should be changed through the legislative branch, through the legislative, quote, democratic, unquote, process. Not through judicial fiat, because the judges get to rule basically on what is their own personal feeling. Yes, you can make the argument, sure, public opinion has changed, but maybe my opinion hasn't changed, or maybe it hasn't changed enough in order for me to say that I'm going to strike down this law. And what constitutes a change in public opinion? 60% of the public changed its mind? 50%? 75%? I don't know. There are no standards. There's no law around this. And so we have the courts making laws and the government following along. And we see this in every Western country now. We see judges who for the most part are unelected, who for the most part are unaccountable, but it doesn't matter whether they're elected or not. What we need to do is this, and this is really what's playing out in Israel right now, and this is what makes it so fascinating, is that the government in Israel, under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu, is actually fighting, taking up a cause that ought to be important for all of us in the Western world that are being subjected to what we know now as judicial activism. Judicial activism on steroids is what happens in Israel. And so now we have the ludicrous example in Israel of the Knesset passing a law that basically says that the Supreme Court cannot strike down a legitimately passed law simply because they determine that it's not reasonable. That's the issue that's going on in Israel right now, the specifics of the issue. But it's on a broader level, it has to do with what is the role of the judiciary in a free and democratic society. And here's what I think the role of the judiciary is. Plain and simple, is to determine whether or not the actions of an individual have violated a legitimately passed law. And to the degree that you have a written constitution or that you have a clear constitutional framework that may not be entirely written, but it's the traditional way that we've done things all along for hundreds of years. So it has the power of a constitution. The role of the judiciary in that case may be to say to the legislative branch, you can't do that because it does violate our Constitution. So there is a role for the judges to be able to strike down laws so long as they understand that the basis for striking down laws is whether or not the law that's the subject of the adjudication has actually violated a clear principle within the Constitution. That doesn't exist in Israel right now, and that is what the government of Israel is fighting for. And again, I bring it back to here in Canada, and certainly in the United States, we can point to many instances. Roe versus Wade was probably the most famous or infamous act of a government acting or striking down laws based on a living constitution idea. Okay, so we're going to follow this more closely moving forward. I'm going to be reporting on it regularly, but I want you to wrap your mind around that, ladies and gentlemen, because really, in a sense, here in Canada and in other Western countries, we really do need to address the whole issue of separation of powers and what is the role of the judiciary in a democratic system. Because I see over and over again unelected judges who bring their own personal views, their own personal biases, left-wing and right-wing, but mostly left-wing, in order to force the government to adopt policies that the people do not want. It makes a mockery of the democratic process. Hopefully we'll get to this again tomorrow, because there are specific cases that are starting to come up now that I want you to know about that really take advantage of this problem and really illustrate why it's so important, what they're doing in Israel now, and what we should be doing here in Canada as well, and in other Western countries, particularly the United States. Judicial reform. But in the meantime, we have to go for our third break. So stick with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thanks for sticking with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for September the 13th, Wednesday, September the 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and we're moving right along here on our show towards the hour time frame. So this day in history. A couple of things that are going to be of interest to you. First of all, if you're from Canada, for Canadians, on this day in the year 1759, British forces defeated the French in the Battle of Quebec, also known, ladies and gentlemen, of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And this profoundly changed the history of North America, because a great deal of North America was actually a French colony. And when the British beat the French forces in the Battle of Quebec, that effectively ended French rule that is to say France rule in the northern part of North America that later on became Canada. So the Battle of Quebec was today and in 1759. So I thought that would be an interesting little bit of information. Also today, ladies and gentlemen, in the year 1971, a revolt at New York's Attica Correctional Facility ended after a long siege when state police assaulted the prison. 29 inmates were killed in that assault, along with 10 of the hostages that were being held. So that was today in 1971, Attica. Also today, the television series, this is for you culture buffs out there, the television series Law and Order first debuted in 1990. And that show became one of the longest running primetime TV dramas in United States history. Finally, because now we're going to talk about real history, other than the Battle of Quebec, of course, on this day in 1598, Philip III was crowned King of Spain and Portugal. He was known to be virtuous in his private affairs and somewhat indifferent as a ruler. He was also extravagant in his spending, which exacerbated Spain's growing economic problems. And of course, Spain, became what it is today. Lost its colonies eventually. And now it's not a third world country, but it's not exactly one of the leading countries in the world. If you're asking for my own personal, very narrow opinion. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is pretty much it for tonight's show. Appreciate you tuning in. As always, check out the website, www.josephbenami.com. All one word without the hyphen. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our email updates. And we will catch you again tomorrow night. In the meantime, God bless. And remember, do not ever drink the Kool-Aid.